the mechanism of death. What physiologically happened to him that resulted in the end of life? That's what we're talking about. The cause of death is crucifixion. The mechanism of death, that's a little more tricky.
Welcome back to our new episode of Reasons Podcast, dear viewers. Today, to help us think through this important topic, we have with us a very special guest who's also the author of a very interesting book entitled as The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Welcome, Dr. Joseph Bergeron.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
I would like to first ask you the question, what led you to writing this book?
Well, the book is a product of 10 years of study. I first started reading what physicians had written about Jesus' crucifixion and what they thought his cause of death was. And I found that there was a lack of agreement among them, which I found curious. I think that it led me, what I didn't know that it would lead me into a 10-year study to examine the medical facts, because it just seemed to me that if we studied it carefully, through a forensic reconstruction of the events, we would be able to determine what more likely than not was the actual cause of Jesus' death. Jesus didn't die in a hospital, so we don't have hospital records, but we can look at the events and we can reconstruct what happened to him, and that we should be able to make accurate conclusions. And so that launched me into a study that I didn't expect of 10 years that ultimately resulted in the book you have.
May I ask you, in what way has this work of yours, especially on this topic, and especially through the writing of this book, how has it helped you in terms of deepening your faith or,
It made me more convinced than ever before that the things I believe as a Christian are actually true. It had the effect of, I believe Jesus died of traumatic hemorrhagic shock, which was a blood loss. And I proposed in my medical journal article that Jesus died of a complication of shock where his blood lost the ability to clot. And Jesus himself, at his Last Supper, he took the blood, the cup and the bread, and he said, of the cup, he said, "This is my blood, which is poured out for the remission of sins." And after 2 years of study and writing an article, and then it occurred to me when I read that verse, I thought, he told us his cause of death. He told us he died of blood loss. How could we think something else? People will talk about, did Jesus suffocate and those types of things. Those are really not medically logical, and we can talk about that in detail. But the primary point is that Jesus died of blood loss. The importance of the shed blood of Jesus in Christian theology is enormous, and we should align our thinking and our study if it's at least medically logical, but it should also be theologically correct. And so one effect that it had on me is when I hear songs about the blood of Jesus or people talk, it affects me emotionally because my mind goes to the idea that his blood lost the capacity to stop bleeding. It's a known complication of traumatic hemorrhagic shock. And so in some ways it's difficult for me to listen to that kind of song. It affects me emotionally. It affects me emotionally talking about it right now. And that has a lot of explanatory power about how Jesus died.
In your book now, you also mention that had it been that it was a fabricated story, there is every way that even today with the advancement in the medical field, it is possible that the medical research can serve as a framework to scrutinize if the story is fabricated or not. Was the execution of Jesus different from others who have been crucified?
Yes, Jesus, what happened to Jesus has medical importance. First, Jesus, he had his Last Supper with his disciples, which was a Passover Seder, and he went to the garden to pray. Now, in Matthew, it records that Jesus said, my soul is in grief to the point I feel like I'm dying. So we have this intense emotional thing that Jesus was experiencing because he knew exactly what was going to happen. that he was going to be crucified. He had seen crucifixions. He would have had to. They were common forms of execution. But also he understood the spiritual implication of bearing the sins of humanity. It was something that put him in an emotional condition that he felt like he was going to die at that moment. And we should not miss the importance of that moment. That's where it's said that Jesus sweat drops of blood. Then, and this is medically significant, he goes through a series of beatings. He's arrested and he's taken to the house of the high priest, Caiaphas. Annas was the father of Caiaphas, father-in-law, and he had been the high priest previously, and then Caiaphas was the high priest, and they lived in a multi-generational mansion. So Jesus is taken there, and he's on secret trial. And this is where they beat him. They condemn him of blasphemy for saying he is the Son of God and the Messiah, and they beat him. They cover him and they beat him with their fists and say, "Prophesy to us, who's hitting you, Messiah? Who's hitting you?" And so he goes through a thrashing there. And you know that the Jews by that point had lost the ability of capital punishment, but they would have beaten him to the point that as much as they could without killing him. Then he goes to Pilate. Pilate sends him to Herod Antipas, who puts a purple robe on him, sends him back to Pilate. Then in Mark it says a whole company of soldiers beat him. So you understand, the Romans were anti-Semitic. They didn't like Jewish people. Then you have someone who says, I am the king of the Jews. I am the Messiah. How do you think they would react? They created a crown of thorns. And what the crown of thorns was in Roman culture, they made crowns. And the highest honor in Roman culture was the corona gramina, the crown of grass. And what that would be is that it would be awarded, the army would vote and award the general with the crown of grass if he had saved them from destruction and led them to victory. And how they would make the crown would be to take plant material from the place they conquered and make a crown for their general. And so here they are, the whole company of soldiers beating him. Then they're mocking him as if he had conquered the Roman army. So you see their hatred for him at that point. So they would have beat him, rigorously. Then he was scourged. Now all of the crucifixion people would have been scourged. That's the third beating now Jesus is taking, which they would have scourged all over his body. Eusebius, a Christian historian, he wrote that scourging would be so severe that it would expose the veins, arteries, and inner organs. So you can imagine how severe the beating would be. This is medically important because Jesus is having a series of beatings. What would not be obvious to anyone until the crucifixion time, Jesus died remarkably fast, 6 hours. Crucifixion could last for days. It was meant to be a prolonged punishment with no injury to any vital organ, but Jesus died in 6 hours. That means that something was physiologically happening in his body that was not visually apparent to anyone else to make him die so quickly, and that his body was progressing into shock. Shock in English language could mean electricity, it could mean being surprised, but in medical language, shock means the decreased oxygen delivery, and in this context, it's from the loss of blood. And so that creates a chemical cascade in the body that would result in a death, sometimes a very rapid death. And so Jesus died so rapidly, and it was a series of beatings that are medically important in his history that created a scenario, a cascade of events that placed him in a state of shock that made him die much quicker than the people that were crucified with him that day.
Even the Bible in the Gospel of Luke chapter 22, verse 44, it actually says that Jesus, while he was going through all of this, he was in agony. And he prayed more earnestly, and then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Did Jesus really sweat blood, or was this just a figure of speech?
Oh, no. And I didn't understand that for a long time, probably until I entered the study. I thought that doesn't happen, But the truth is that it does happen. There are very few cases in medical literature, but there are some, because it's a very rare occurrence. And Jesus is called hematidrosis, which means sweating blood. And Jesus had the most rare form, which is called single episode psychogenic hematidrosis, and it always occurred before injury. Usually before execution is when these things have been observed. And so some people have questioned those verses to whether they, were, fabricated or false in some way. But the problem is, it really does happen. It's very, very rare. It's so rare that we could call it a medical mystery, but it's so rare that we don't really understand how it occurs. And I include a couple of cases in my book that were well studied of two young ladies that were admitted to the hospital. They had extensive evaluation, biopsies, blood testing, everything, and still they couldn't identify exactly what was happening to produce the blood exuding from their skin, which was obvious in photographs and biopsies and those sorts of things. So yes, it does happen. It's very, very rare, but it speaks to the frame of mind that Jesus was in. Jesus would not have lost a lot of blood from doing that, but it says something about his emotional tenor. As I said previously in Matthew, I think it says that he was in the frame of mind that he said, I feel like I'm going to die. That level of emotional, anxiety produced this kind of very rare effect. And, Luke was a physician. He probably knew that this kind of thing could occur. I think he must have thought that it was important fact to write down. And just as a salute to physicians in the Bible, Luke, as a physician, is a contributor of the largest volume of text to the New Testament. So,
and moreover, Luke is also a physician himself.
And traditionally considered an evangelist also.
And, for many of us who read the narrative given in the gospel, when it talks about the crucifixion, the Roman crucifixion, now you've done extensive work on this. Can you describe to us the Roman crucifixion practices?
The person would have to carry the horizontal section of the cross. The cross would be in two sections. The vertical section would be stationary and permanent in the ground. The individual for the tau cross, which would be shaped like a capital T in the English language, horizontal section would be carried by the condemned person. They would walk naked through the street. They would carry a sign that said the felonies for which they were being executed. They would be scourged with a whip by multiple soldiers. There was an execution team that was supervised by a centurion. And we see that in Mark's gospel, where Pilate asked the centurion for verification of Jesus' death. So there was a centurion overseeing all that process. The group of soldiers would scourge the entire body with, there would be leather strips with dumbbell or lead balls sewn into the end of it that would rip the flesh that I mentioned Eusebius's observation. After that, the individual would be nailed, almost always nailed, unless they were not available. They would be tied, and they would be nailed through the wrist and through the feet. They would nail the hands outstretched, and then the soldiers would lift the horizontal section and place it on top of the vertical section, which would have a mortise and tenon coupling. And so if you can get the idea, the cross could not be very high. It had to be short enough that the soldiers could lift it and put it on top. So the victim being crucified and the soldiers would be eye to eye. And then the feet would be nailed. Now, there are very few remains that have been found of crucifixion victims, and I put a couple of the more remarkable ones in the book. And, hundreds of thousands of people would have been crucified over the 6 centuries that the Romans utilized crucifixion. We only have a very small handful of cases that have been found. The reason is that the Romans would leave the bodies on the cross to be devoured by scavenging animals, so the remains are not present. But the hands would be nailed. If you if you take your hand and you bend your ring finger down as far as you can to the bottom of the vertical crease in your wrist, and if you drive a nail through there, it will create a stable fixation of the hand, which would withstand 245 pounds of distraction force. If you put it in the center of the hand, it would pull out with 100 pounds of force. And the reason I know that is the French physician and surgeon Pierre Barbet did a study of hands that he had to amputate, and he did exactly that experiment to find out how the nail could rest within the wrist bones and what the forces would be. So we know that occurs, or we know that that's how it would be done and create a stable fixation so that the body would not be able to come down from the cross. The feet, the archaeological remains are that the nail was driven through the side of the heel. That may seem peculiar to a lot of people because we see pictures where the nail goes through the top of...
So how was the hands and the feet, nailed to the cross for...
Yes, the hands were nailed to the horizontal section. Then the victim was lifted and placed on top of the vertical section. Then the feet would have been nailed to the cross after that. And the archaeological finds that we have show that the nail was placed through the heel and then into the cross. So that's probably how it was done. The imagery that we have in artwork where the nails go through the top of the feet, that's artistic imagination. Any form of artwork that depicts Jesus didn't come into Christian worship until about the 6th century. So crucifixes, artwork that depicts Jesus in a positive way, didn't come into Christian worship until then. So anybody that painted a painting of Jesus never saw a crucifixion, so they had to make up in their mind what they thought it would look like.
Now, coming to another important dimension, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 34, speaks of this important part in the entire process of the crucifixion of Christ, where it mentions that for one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Now, the question I want to ask you is, why did water and blood come out of Jesus' chest wound from the spear? What are its significance?
That's a very curious observation. Origen, the church father, thought it was a miraculous sign, but it wasn't. Fluid can collect around the chest, in the chest wall, inside the chest cavity, around the lungs. And it can happen for different reasons, disease states of different types, but it can also occur just from simply blunt trauma to the chest, which would have been the case with Jesus. So he had fluid collecting around his lungs. That's something that's called a pleural effusion, and that would be clear. And so to someone, an observer on the scene, the spear entering the chest would encounter a clear fluid. They would think it was water. When it punctured the heart, it would mix with blood, and then the fluid would look like blood. And so what was a mystery to many people, maybe still is a mystery to a lot of readers, is easily understood medically, that Jesus had a pleural effusion that was punctured, and then the heart was punctured. Everyone saw that. John was standing there and he saw it and he records it. He's redundant. He said, I was there, I saw this, but everyone else saw it too. In Luke 23, it says that everyone that knew Jesus was watching from a distance. That's why Thomas said, I'm not going to believe until I put my hand in his chest wall. Yes. So now this is an important observation, important fact, because these people are not medically educated. How would they understand? John wasn't a physician, and medical science is different today than it was then. So we have this observation that we can easily understand medically in modern medical understanding that they didn't understand. And many thought it was a miraculous sign. So the evidence that we see in the Gospels that is understandably medically, which is what we're talking about, is intrinsic evidence that the biblical descriptions of Jesus' crucifixion are accurate. If they were fabricated, we could look at the events, and as a physician, when I watch a movie and they show some sort of medical thing, I immediately know. I mean, it ruins the movie for me because I immediately know if it's wrong or that if it's misunderstood in some way. It's just obvious to a physician when they hear people talk about medical things that are inaccurate. When we look at the Gospels, and I can look at that and say that's precisely medically understandable, that's intrinsic evidence within the biblical writing themselves that they are accurate.
What was Jesus' cause of death?
Jesus' cause of death was crucifixion. But in medicine, when we talk about the cause of death, what we're really talking about is the mechanism of death. What physiologically happened to him that resulted in the end of life? That's what we're talking about. So the cause of death is crucifixion. The mechanism of death, that's a little more tricky. But when we talk about suffocation, that's really a modern idea, modern meaning within the past 100 years. It was originally proposed by a French surgeon named Lebec and a Czechoslovakian surgeon named Hynek, who were aware of suffocation or suspension torture in the Austro-Hungarian War. That was also in the Nazi penal code. And so where the idea that Jesus suffocated became popular was in Dr. Barbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary. And in his book, he describes someone in a Nazi concentration camp that was suspended with his hands overhead. His feet were unsupported. They even put weights on his feet. And that poor individual suffocated to death in 3 hours. So Dr. Barbet thought, well, maybe that's what happened with crucifixion. But you can understand that sort of mechanism, the dynamics, the vector forces on the chest were different than crucifixion, which was to the side and the feet were supported. And so, just the mechanics of how that happened was different. Also, that individual that Dr. Barbet described died in 3 hours, where crucifixion could take days. And then the other telling thing, and again, that's why I say this is a modern idea, modern only within the past 100 years. If you look at ancient writings, Philip of Alexandria, for example, not a Christian, he was a historian. He wrote about how people died of crucifixion. He thought they died of starvation. People on the scene, what is not present in ancient literature about crucifixion observation is the idea that they had any trouble breathing at all. They believed that the people died from deprivation.
But if I may interrupt, why is it important for us to understand the death of Jesus? Why is it important?
Because it tells us that the biblical accounts are accurate. It's intrinsic evidence. C.S. Lewis, he understood. He was an atheist. He came to faith later in his life, but one of the things that bothered him was he understood that the Gospels were not mythological literature. In mythological literature, it would be very obvious if something's medically accurate or not. Jesus, at the Last Supper, he took the bread and the cup, and he said, "This is my blood, which is poured out for the sins of many." And Jesus died of traumatic hemorrhagic shock. The name says everything. Trauma means injury. Hemorrhage means bleeding. Shock means decreased blood circulation to end organs that ultimately produces a chemical cascade of events in the body that causes people to die. In Jesus' case, died very quickly. When we look at that and other explanations about suffocation and those kind of things, we must understand we should align our speech with what is medically logical at a minimum, but we should, more importantly, align our speech with what is theologically important. Jesus did not suffocate for the forgiveness of our sins. He shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. He died of exsanguination by blood loss. And the Gospels show that story, that he progressed that way. Jesus was on the cross talking to the other felons that were with him, to his mother, to John. I've never seen anyone suffocate, but I've seen people die from pulmonary death. They don't talk. They don't yell out at the moment. Jesus yelled at the cross when he died. People that are suffocating don't yell. They don't want to have a conversation. They're trying to obtain the last breath of life. So these kind of things give us medical information. Jesus was on the cross and he said, "I thirst." When people are progressing into shock, there's two mechanisms in their body that create thirst. We have pressure sensors in our arteries called baroreceptors, and they will stimulate the thirst centers in the brain. Then the kidneys have what's called the angiotensin system that will stimulate the brain by a hormone mechanism to say to the victim, "You don't have enough blood volume, you need water right away." And so you have two physiologic systems stimulating the brain and creating a sense of thirst that is beyond any thirst that you or I have ever experienced. It's madness. It's where people, have hallucinations of water and that kind of thing. And that's part of the suffering of Jesus that's often overlooked. But this is well understood medically. But Jesus said, to fulfill the scriptures, he said, "I thirst." And so there are many attestations in the biblical account that are understandable medically that may not be obvious, but they're present. And if it was fabricated, it would be easily discernible to a medical reader.
But it's very interesting that you've mentioned that medically today we can understand more about what the theological truth that emerges out of the text and the scripture. And it only affirms the truth of what is being said, while they did not even know much of what today we know medically.
Yes, absolutely.
And both seems to corroborate in terms of that. And this has really been very helpful to reflect on the crucifixion of Christ and what it means to us. But definitely it needs to be connected with the truth of what the Bible talks about, what Jesus has accomplished. Thank you, Dr. Bergeron, for these insights. And I would encourage our viewers, for those of you who might be interested, to dive deeper into these truths that have been shared. There is this book that Dr. Bergeron has written. It is entitled as The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and the resurrection of Christ. Once again, thank you. It's been a joy to talk to you.
It's my pleasure, completely.
Thank you.
Thank you.